Thank you all for coming. My name is Chloe Dennelsbeck, and I am the social director for the History, Law, and Society Executive Board. If the board could just raise their hands, they were part of the planning process for the event. Thank you, guys. So just briefly, I want to talk about when we started planning this event. I remember we were sitting in President Shank's office, and she asked us to go around the table and just introduce ourselves and why we were interested in planning this event, why we, as History, Law, and Society majors and as students, wanted to be a part of this. And I remember I immediately thought of my work at a summer camp because I noticed I worked there for about 4 years, and I noticed that our training for being a counselor started changing. We started having active shooter training, and to think that we needed to know what to do with 20 kindergartners in case of an active shooter really struck me. And so we're really honored to be a part of this event. And I'm sure you all have reasons for coming to this event and being interested in this topic and this cause. I would like to introduce President Shank to get us started. And thank you all for coming.
I'm so happy to have this many people tonight because it's Black History Month. We have things going on in every nook and cranny of this university right now. So I'm really pleased that a number of you came out tonight to support us and to attend this first evening. So I'm really proud, first and foremost, to co-sponsor this event with all of our partners. And that includes, of course, the Student Executive Board of History, Law, and Society. There isn't anybody on campus, anybody paying attention at AUP knows what an impact this group of students is having on our campus by, if you attended the other night, the evening on migrant justice, but also where students recounted their experience of going to the southern border with their professors. It was a really powerful evening indeed, and a wonderful moment of witness. I would call that a moment of witness. Also, I'm proud to have our partners here from the American Church, Scott Herr, my longtime friend and AUP father, as it happens, and also the founder, along with Alexander Blumrosen, who is an American lawyer living here in Paris, of the Newtown Remembrance Group. And I don't know if the students here remember, but certainly the adults in this room remember the Newtown tragedy where 20 6-year-olds were gunned down in cold blood along with many of their teachers. For many of us watching from the sidelines, that was the moment when we felt that there would be an absolute turnaround in American political history because finally the American people would recognize the dangers of gun violence to see 20 little 6-year-olds gunned down. So since that time, I think every year you've been hosting at the American Church, Scott, an event, different people coming, different speakers, different politicians weighing in each year. And I think that's sort of one of the bookends that produced the impetus for this evening. And the second bookend is, of course, what happened at Marjorie Stoneman High School last year in 2018, what we call the sort of Parkland kids who came out of that, the student activists who came out of that, and who have done in an extraordinary way galvanized the attention of Americans around the issue of gun safety. And one of the reasons we wanted to have Delaney Tarr with us tonight is precisely so that you could hear directly from these students themselves and you could pose questions. So before I hand the evening over to all of these actors, because lots of the students are going to participate and do some of the introductions and kind of launch things, I want to say that this is the first event in a whole series of events that I hope to be co-hosting through the President's Office and with various different actors on campus between now and the presidential election in the fall. And I will basically and all of these events are going to bring to the fore critical issues that will come up in the election and that should be part of your decision making if you hold American citizenship and can vote, should be part of your decision making in the fall. So we'll be talking about immigration. We'll be talking about I made a whole list of them here. We'll be talking about women's rights. We'll be talking about gun safety. We'll be talking about the environment, a whole series of issues that are important in your decision making for the fall. And also at all of these events, I'm going to not get down off my bully pulpit, which I get to have in a university, which is to remind each of you how absolutely precious a vote is, how absolutely critical it is to be registered to vote, no matter which side of the political spectrum you find yourself on. to register your vote in a primary, which is a way of signaling to your party what your preference is for the person who will represent the party in the national election, and also for for the election itself. It's an absolutely. I've heard so many people tell me, in a sea of votes, my vote won't count at all. But after the election in 2016, I heard from lots of students and lots of adults and lots of friends who said, I wish I'd gone to the trouble to vote. So to save you that kind of Monday morning quarterback regret, one of the things we're going to do on campus is we're going to cajole you and persuade you and remind you until you are sick to death of hearing from me of how these primary dates are approaching. And I think tonight one of the students is going to give you the primary dates so that you know which ones are coming up. You have about a month still before each primary to register and also to get your absentee ballot and to vote. I know how hard this can be. During the 2016 election, I had to ask my county in Florida 13 times for an absentee ballot, and they did not send it to me. 13 times. You're from Florida, right? You know my state. So finally, I wrote an email to the supervisor of elections, and I said, if I don't have my ballot by tomorrow, which was a few days before the election, I just want you to know I'm a university president, and I'm going to write an article for the New York Times on the way that my vote was taken from me, despite 13 requests. And I think of all the people who didn't have the time to request 13 times a ballot. So I'm saying this because I don't think for a minute that a vote doesn't count. And remember also that not voting also has unintended consequences and can end up being a different kind of vote, like a vote for a candidate you didn't intend to vote for. So the state primaries in the U.S. began last week with the crazy Iowa caucus, which as far as I know is not yet over, and also tonight with the New Hampshire primaries. So we are kind of off and running with lots of surprises for most people. I think some people kind of sleepily went into this whole thing and assumed that Biden would be the nominee, and now everything is up for grabs. There's a whole different order to things. And I think it's really interesting to see what's emerging from the voters, and then we'll have tonight, and we have a lot of other primaries before us. So it's really a moment for you to inform yourselves, talk to friends, talk to your professors, and make the right decision in the primaries, because that'll have huge impact on the election. I want to thank Ricky Mark for being here tonight with his laptop. He has created on his laptop a voting registration site, and it's portable. It goes everywhere he goes, and you can stop him in the halls, and he will sign you up and also help you get your absentee ballot in addition to signing up for your state. And he now has a list of the primaries on his site. So I believe that you're a one-stop shop now for people who are interested in voting. And I also want to thank Renee, who's standing back there, who's the president of the GSC and who has taken on the role of being a liaison with all of the volunteer organizations in Paris, most of them nonpartisan, all of them nonpartisan really, who are making it possible for Americans to vote from abroad. So thank you. And I think the next time they're going to be on campus is Friday, right? Good. So just to say one little word, I mean, I could talk for 3 hours about gun control. It happens to be one of my issues that I'm deeply passionate about. And I don't have time. So I'm going to say 3 things. The whole world was watching in 2018 as a group of student survivor activists rose upon the ashes of the deadly mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. While they were struggling with their own stress and grief, they created March for Our Lives, which happened, I guess, about 4, 5, 6 months later, something like that. If you didn't watch Emma give her speech during that, it was the most effective and powerful political speech I have ever heard in my lifetime. If you didn't hear her and all the other students who followed her and who spoke before and after her, it was an extraordinary moment. Those students mounted a march and then an organization which has since taken a leading role in the national debate surrounding gun control. They believe in grassroots organization through youth mobilization. They have done a bus ride across the United States, stopping at multiple places on the way. In August 2019, so very recently, they issued a smart, multi-pronged policy proposal for gun control legislation. And what I found so brilliant about this proposal is, instead of treating the epidemic of gun violence in the U.S. as a public health issue, a public health epidemic, to which our president needs to turn urgently, instead of a polarized debate over Second Amendment issues, which ends up with people on one or another side of the divide, or even a gun lobby and gun makers issue, which truthfully it is. It certainly is, but that's also a place where we get stymied on either side of a divide. Instead, they very intelligently laid out a bold proposal for reducing gun deaths sharply and building local solutions. And you're going to hear more about that tonight, and you're going to be able to ask questions about it too.
So next up we have Lauren Naines. She is a History, Law, and Society and Journalism major, and she will be introducing Delaney.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So Delaney Tarr is a survivor of the mass shooting that took place in Stoneman Douglas High School that killed about 17 individuals and injured 17 other students. She and among other of her peers and colleagues were able to turn something so dire into not only a political calling for change, but also an overall and collective group in order to tell people that voting is important. So along with March for Our Lives that took place on the 24th of March, she has conducted interviews with news channels. She's written articles herself about the importance of voting, the importance of gun reform, and preventing deaths by the use of guns. I believe that she's going to give a great talk today to all of us about what's important and what's necessary about having your vote casted. And yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you.
We're turning it over to you.
All right, much appreciated. Actually, my name is Delaney Tarr, founder of For Our Lives. Before I start speaking, I just want to share that this Friday will be 2 years since the shooting. That really is where this all began. Was that shooting? It was about the fact that we were so mobilized from the very start, but it's been 2 years, 2 crazy years of successes and failures and strife, but also passion and change and something so amazing. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of the March for Our Lives, because it happened so quickly. Our original strengths, I think, came from the fact that we had cameras. We had cameras all around us because everybody wanted to cover the Parkland shooting, as they called it. These students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School who had just dealt with a horrible trauma, we were on screens all across the nation, and I don't think we were prepared for it. But we knew that amidst all of that trauma and pain, there was something else. There was determination and this iron will to create something positive, some sort of change out of something so awful. So we sat down on the living room carpet of one of our peers and we organized. We had a lot of very strange phone calls in the beginning with journalists from everywhere, with high-up politicians and celebrities who wanted to help us make a change, and it was all very overwhelming. At the same time, we were doing interviews. We were speaking at rallies. Many of us spoke at that rally that Emma Gonzalez gave her famous speech, and from there, we just kept organizing. We actually held the March for Our Lives on March 24th, which, as you may know, is only a month and 10 days after the shooting, or a couple, it was a little bit of time. Not enough time to plan a march. I wouldn't recommend it, but we managed to get it done with the work of so many people. We built this massive coalition of activists and organizers all across the country who organized the march not just in Washington, D.C., but everywhere. We had over 800 sibling marches all across the world, and those were not organized by us, but by other students, other young people who were impassioned, ready to organize and mobilize for change, for a safer, better America. So beyond the fact that we had cameras, I think it's also important to speak to the fact that we understood young people. I mean, we are young people. It had been mentioned before in the introductions that we were not the only mass shooting. And after Newtown, a lot of people push forward the rhetoric of, if this doesn't cause a change, what will? It was disheartening to hear that so often in the beginning, to hear if these children getting murdered couldn't change something, how do you think that you'll make a change? And one of our strengths was that we were the victims. We were the survivors, and we had the ability to speak out in a way that other people haven't, in a way that victims haven't been able to, in a way that children haven't been able to. We were that age demographic who was so online and so educated in that informal Twitter way, where we knew the injustices in America. We were aware of gun violence as an epidemic, and we had experienced it. And frankly, that wasn't going to silence us. We weren't willing to sit back and let the cameras capitalize on our grief without doing something about it. So there was the march, but beyond that, we also did a lot of lobbying. We did protests, we did interviews, as was previously mentioned. We spoke at any number of events. It was a lot of saying yes to pretty much everything, so we could get our foot in the door, so we could be remembered and be more than just a blip in American history. Protest was truly our strongest avenue. We protested not only in Washington, but all over. Had marches in Parkland, but we also went to Chicago. We went to Tallahassee in Florida, our capital. We went everywhere simply so that we could show not just that our voices were there, but that our bodies were there. We were physically present and ready to create a change. Of course, after the march came the question of what next. It was easy to dismiss us as a one and done, as that event being the only thing that the March for Our Lives did. And I think that that was a lot of the concern that comes with gun violence prevention in general, is that constant question of what's next? How are you going to innovate? How are you going to create change that's lasting? And we had to maintain our traction, and that took a lot of innovation and a lot of thinking. And once again, it took youth power and youth mobilization. We organized something called the Road to Change, which was our voter registration tour that we did over the summer, all across America and in every congressional district in Florida. The Road to Change came out of this realization that we had pretty early on that Congress wasn't necessarily willing to work with us, and that the executive branch was definitely not willing to work with us. We thought at the beginning that we might be able to get some leeway, that we might be able to get some policies passed, but doors were shut in our face, we weren't taken seriously, and honestly, it just radicalized us more. And we realized that if we wanted a Congress that would work with us, we had to get them elected. We had to vote. We had to vote for policies and people that would do the right thing. So we registered Americans to vote. We went all across the country, and we had panels and town halls, and in that we met the face of an America ravaged by an epidemic full of tragedy and pain that looked different in every single community. We met all of the organizers who had put on these incredible sibling marches, and we learned of the work that they had been doing to pass local ordinances, to get state laws passed, to communicate with their legislators directly. It was inspiring, honestly, and it was a large part of what kept us going, knowing that we weren't the only ones in the fight, far from it. And in that, we kept the spirit of constant innovation, of reestablishing the norms and changing a system that honestly is broken and flawed and constructed specifically to hurt people and to keep them oppressed. It was a huge payoff. I don't want to toot our own horn, but there was record youth turnout in the midterm elections in 2018. And the reality is that in that short span of a few months, we had registered tens of thousands of voters. And not only us, but other youth organizations had registered tens of thousands of voters. It was incredible to see so many people go out and vote for something that they believed in. Over 24 NRA officials ended up getting kicked out of their positions, with many gun sense candidates getting elected into office. And sure, they weren't all victories. There were some elections that were frankly kind of upsetting to us because they weren't gun sense candidates getting elected, and oftentimes they were running on platforms that were directly contrary to what we believed in. But we wouldn't let that destroy our spirits, because really we had to redefine success. It's upsetting to know, but the wheels of bureaucracy are slow turning, and change doesn't happen overnight. So after that election, we realized our work was still not done. It's a long, arduous process, but one election could not solve a crisis that has spent so many years in the making, spent so many years holding a grip on American people. In those victories came failures, yes. We saw the candidates that we didn't like get elected. So yeah, just gotta be frank about it. We saw a lot of shootings, and in that came this sense of guilt and this thought that maybe we weren't doing enough. In reality, that was not our responsibility. It shouldn't be up to the young people of America to keep shootings from happening. It should be up to our government, up to Congress, and up to legislators who need to prevent gun violence from being an epidemic. But we tried to work as fast as we could, and every time we would see another news report, we would know that they were experiencing the same pain as us. And that hurt. It hurt, and sometimes it took a lot out of us, but we kept working. Beyond that, I think maybe the biggest thing that we had to deal with was reconciling with the actual foundations of the March for Our Lives. I mean, even now, we're still called the Parkland kids, and honestly, it can be a little bit damaging. We were born out of privilege, and that's the truth. We were born out of tragedy, yes, but it was a circumstance that came from privilege. We were a white, affluent community that got cameras because of that. Because this was an area that didn't look like it would be affected by gun violence in the everyday. People were paying attention to us, they were listening to us, and we knew that it was about privilege. So we had to reconcile with it, we had to correct it. Because truthfully, that wasn't sustainable. We weren't including every person affected by gun violence. In fact, we weren't including the majority of people affected by gun violence. So on that tour, we actually had to do a lot of learning. A lot of unlearning white supremacy and relearning the systems of power in America and how to deconstruct them. We met with people in cities that are heavily impacted by gun violence, be it Chicago, New York, Milwaukee. Even Midwestern areas and smaller communities had their own relationships to gun violence and their own understandings of the epidemic. We also learned that we only had one experience, and we couldn't speak beyond that. We had one day, one story of gun violence, and that was ours to tell, but we were not at liberty to share the stories of others, of people who have seen gun violence in the streets, who have seen systemic issues leading to gang violence, leading to these issues all in different communities that were impacting them. They could speak to it, and we couldn't, so logically, the only method to really solve that was to bring them with us. We brought so many different people with us on the tour, and in that we learned the power of stories and the power of their voices, not just ours. We didn't just take the mic and speak for them, but we passed it on. Passing the megaphone it's a thing that we talk about in activist circles a lot, but it truly is important to include a variety of voices and experiences to make sure that you're getting the whole of the issue. We couldn't speak for them, we brought them on. We couldn't be tokenistic, though, either. It had to be substantial. In the beginning, bringing on students of color and students from disproportionately affected communities, it wasn't enough. We were simply throwing them out there on a stage and saying, please share your stories, and that was, frankly, not our best move. So we had to learn. We had to grow. And in those months between the shooting and the road to change and midterms and everything, we learned about leadership and how to best effectively be leaders, and that is truly to pass on leadership and to understand that you are not simply leading followers, you are leading leaders. It sounds like a lot, but it's the truth. We were working with these people from different organizations all across America and different experiences all across America, and they were the ones who were able to take our movement and make it something sustainable, make it something lasting in every community and nationally. And with that knowledge comes a crash course on the intersection of not just people and intersectionality, but intersection of different issues and policies. We learned the way that different issues impact gun violence in America, because truly it is all intertwined. We learned through both a formal and an informal education the way that things like class and poverty, education, healthcare, specifically in the mental illness realm, LGBTQ plus issues and women's rights, environmental racism, all of these things came into play when we were talking about gun violence. Sometimes it was more visible than others. We have blatant hate crimes, things like the Pulse shooting, which was at a nightclub, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida in 2016, I believe, where people were gunned down, and it was a hate crime. There was things like shootings at synagogues, which were blatantly anti-Semitic and, once again, hate crimes. But there's also the more nuanced aspects of it, things like mental health as an issue and talking about healthcare for people, not just in the physical realm, but in the mental one, too. Because, unfortunately, 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. It was talking about women's rights and domestic violence and how people who are at risk, people who are red flags, should not be able to have a weapon in the household. We had to talk about police brutality because, truthfully, that is a form of gun violence and it needs to be addressed. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And that was, I think, the biggest flaw going in, was essentially predicating the march on mass shootings. And really, that is not the bulk of gun violence in America. It's in every day. It's in suicide. It's in domestic violence. It's in every single type of gun violence besides mass shootings that people see walking to school in the mornings, going to church, going to a concert, just living their lives. So with all of those different communities and different experiences, we had to think of a comprehensive solution. One to address what is ultimately a public health crisis in America. And that is a peace plan. And I think you guys might have the peace plan in front of you, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the different components of it. We have this fun little acronym, CHANGE, and it has some interesting points to it. Specifically, change the standards of gun ownership, half the rate of gun deaths in 10 years, accountability for the gun lobby and industry, naming a director of gun violence prevention, generating community-based solutions, and empowering the next generation. Now, that's pretty vague, but there's a lot of different components that come into play here. You see the more traditional approach to policy and politics in the first part, changing the standards of gun ownership. That is where the policies that we've been pushing for a long time come into play. Things like assault weapons bans, high-capacity magazines being banned, gun buyback programs, and the like. That really is the legislative component that's the most visible. But with that comes the goal of reducing the deaths from gun violence in America. And it sounds broad and it sounds aspirational, but we plan to halve the rate of gun deaths in the next 10 years. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot of different ways to go about doing that. Another component is naming a director of gun violence prevention because, truthfully, we need an urgent federal response, and there just hasn't been one on that scale. We've seen many local ordinances and state laws passed, and that is incredible, but federal legislation is the thing that can make the most impact, that can prevent things like interstate gun trafficking and issues of communities needing something more, something stronger. Perhaps the most interesting component, to me at least, is generating community-based solutions. Because it's easier to get caught up in policies as solving everything, but the reality is that not everything can be solved with a law. Not every community can be addressed with a law. So things like mental and behavioral health services, things like domestic violence prevention, things like programs to prevent police brutality, these are all solutions to gun violence, but they simply must be achieved through something more than a law. And that's why we need community-based solutions. Things that can address the needs of every city and state and town in America, because every single one of them has a different face, a different story, and a different experience that they carry with them. Perhaps most important to everyone is empowering the next generation. We've seen an incredible amount of youth power in this generation in general, but there's still a lot of cynicism that comes with it, of feeling left behind. And I think that's where a lot of activism spurs from, but it's also where a lot of disenfranchisement spurs from. And really, this is about reenfranchising the youth, not in a system that neglects them, but to create a new system, one that carries their stories with them. So we had this incredibly comprehensive peace plan, and we released it, but then we realized that we kind of needed to do more than just release a peace plan. So we had to get candidates to sign on. For that, our biggest event, because we did have big events in between all of the everyday organizing, was the gun forum that we held last November with all of the Democratic presidential candidates. It was a landmark event because realistically, the Democratic presidential candidates have never had a forum specifically dedicated to gun violence. They tossed around the word Parkland in many debates prior, but that wasn't anything substantial. that was simply tokenizing a single event, a single name, without realizing how many organizers and how much work went into gun violence prevention and how many solutions we had created for them specifically. So we talked to the candidates. We asked them what their solutions were. And we got a variety of answers, some more satisfying than others, but for the most part, almost every Democratic presidential candidate in some capacity signed on to the peace plan, or components of the peace plan, and really dedicated themselves to solving the gun violence epidemic in America. And I think it was a success. It truly was a success, but we have the candidates, and now we needed to get them elected. Because the core of our organization is not simply talking to politicians and lobbying and schmoozing. It's revolution. It's something that's easy to get lost in an organization that's been around for so long and has had to take so many measures to last. But revolution is the core. It's about empowerment, about changing the goalposts and shifting the system so that it can accommodate everyone, not just the rich and powerful. We are not a part of the institutions in America. We're holding them accountable. And that is, to me, maybe the most important distinction of all. We've been pushed to participate more in these forums. We've had to lobby. We've had to write legislation, even though that's not our job. But this is all done and spurred through the core of what our organization is about, which is change and fighting power that is simply unfair. Fighting systems that are unfair, and really fighting for equity and peace. With this new active generation, there's been so many movements that have been so inspiring. To name a few, I mean, the climate movement and climate strikes. We have This Is 0 Hour in America, which is specifically about climate justice. We have Black Lives Matter. We have women's rights issues, and we have voter justice, because frankly, we have many instances of voter suppression in America. Now, the way to truly create a change is to build coalitions, and that is what these organizations have been doing. They have been reaching out to their peers, radicalizing them, and bringing them along in the fight, because that's what's necessary. Not a top-down organizing, not a few students speaking for the many, not people in power making promises that they're not going to keep, but bottom up. Truly bringing everyone with you from the start so that nobody gets left behind. And that is the power that we bring to this. That is the power that young people can bring to a government that's been ignoring them. Because we know what it's like to be left behind, and we can't do that to anybody else. It's amazing seeing all of these organizations led by impassioned youth, all who understand the power of voting and protest, something that's been drilled into us from things like the civil rights movement, from the Vietnam anti-war movements, from women's rights and LGBT rights, marching in the streets and protesting in a way that's not sanitized and friendly, but is messy and rough, and oftentimes not condoned by the government, because that is not what we're in this for. This is not about getting approval. We are specifically working against the systems that want to give us approval, because we know what must be done, and it's not going to make everybody happy. And that's something that isn't just about gun violence. This is an issue of gun violence, but it's also an issue of so many other things coming together to create a public health crisis in America. Because voting is not just one issue, it's so many. And if you want to get out there and vote, you need to mobilize your peers. If you want change to be made, you need to rally. You need to go and educate yourself, radicalize those around you. Because really, that is the way to make a change. It's unfortunate to know that systems of bureaucracy aren't always friendly to the rapid needs of a young and changing America, but we can create the change. You can create the change. And I think that is absolutely beautiful. So I just want to say that you are the change that you wish to see in the world. And I think it's time that you and everyone claims it. Thank you.
Now we'll open the floor to questions for Delaney.
Hi. My name's Chloe Lyons, and first I wanted to say it's just a real honor to have you and to speak with you. Well, so she can see you. So personally, when I was in my senior year of high school was when the Parkland shooting happened, and it really took a huge effect on our community and really kickstarted my personal activism. So I wanted to say thank you for that. We actually got a number of gun bills passed in Vermont, a state that notoriously has had no gun laws. So it was a really big deal, and it really mobilized my community. So I just wanted to, less of a question and more of just a personal thank you for, just that aspect of my life.
I mean, I would like to say thank you for specifically mobilizing in Vermont, because I know that is that is a gun owner heavy state, and gun legislation is oftentimes not a thing that's really talked about there. But knowing that even in Vermont, no matter where, there was laws passed because of youth activism it's inspiring. And every time we hear about somebody who says they were mobilized by seeing us and seeing what we did, it fuels our fire. It keeps us going, knowing that we're not alone. So thank you for being a part of the fight.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi. So I have a question. It might be a little long-winded, but so after you guys started mobilizing after the shooting, we're like starting to come up with like the legislation that was brought up, and also just like, you know, in terms of how do we mobilize? Do we go to rallies? Like, what do we do? Was there ever a time that you felt like you had to like put aside some like personal views that you had to be like sort of more like practical or more open to sort of more broad legislation because you wanted to see the most change? Like, was that ever a difficulty you faced, was like putting aside any like personal emotions for that?
Mm-hmm. I definitely think that I wouldn't say it's a difficulty, but I do think that part of being in a movement is about compromise. So that is a really good point, honestly, because we may have all had our differences in ideology, as expected in a large group of people, but to really be effective, we had to come forward as a movement, as a strong force. And as the march has gone on in its existence, a lot of us co-founders have had to specify that, like, on our Twitters, our views are our own, because while we do speak for the organization in some capacities, we're human beings, and we have our own viewpoints. We have that luxury now because we are so far removed from what happened, and because a lot of us are now college students and we're not organizing every single day. But in the beginning there, it was about what is the best solution that we can provide, what is the compromise that we can provide, not talking about partisan beliefs or candidates that you might like or dislike, but really focusing on the policies that our organization was pushing. And while we did come together to create those policies, I'm sure that there was some discrepancies in our beliefs. That's only human, it's only natural. It was just about really strategizing to make sure that we came across as a unified front, not fractured. But over time we've learned that while compromise is important, perhaps even more important is doing something called shifting the Overton window, essentially reestablishing the boundaries for what we consider to be politically acceptable. So we push for radical change because we know that if we're not getting the radical change, we're at least going to get something better than if we only pushed for the minuscule and the minutiae. So it's a harder concept to explain, but realistically we did get more radical as time went on because we realized that pushing for the little things was not going to be as successful as pushing for the big and settling for the in-between, if that makes sense.
Hi, I think that you're a wonderful representative for your point of view. Where do you get your funding, and are you running for office? and really, where do you think it's acceptable to get funding?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of our we're donations. We are a 501c3 and 4, so we run entirely on donations. And in the beginning, to put on the march, actually, we got these very massive amounts of public donations. I think it was like Oprah and the Clooneys and Gucci. It was jarring because we kept seeing these huge numbers coming in and being like, whoa, what do we do? So originally it was a lot more of like different businesses and different individuals who are higher profile putting their money towards us. But of course, as time goes on and we rely less and less on the fanfare and more on the organizing, we don't see as many of those big donations. We see a lot of smaller donations. So we have to focus on fundraising. That is a component of it. And that can be in small dollar donations, but it can also be in perhaps somebody donating a little bit of a larger sum, be it a company that we might agree with and we might work with sometimes, be it an individual who has some spare change that they want to throw our way. But we do make sure that we're not sacrificing our beliefs to be able to exist, if that makes sense. Like, we're not going to corrupt ourselves simply to have enough money to be able to continue the work that we're doing. And in terms of running for office, that's a great question. I'm 19. I can't legally run for office yet. I'm currently a student, so I've been enjoying learning about things and really getting that like higher level of education. I mean, you guys are students too, like you know what it's like, and kind of relearning a lot of the things that weren't necessarily properly taught to us, like learning about systems of power and injustice and the way that our country was built and how to actually go about like fixing the problems that we have in America. So it's been a lot of learning. I'm currently a journalism major, so I think of storytelling as an incredibly powerful tool, but I don't really know what my future holds. It's a surprise. Anyone?
Yes. Hi, sorry. I'm just wondering, so the American University is a very international school, and I know there are a lot of Americans who are students here that really care about this topic, but there are also a lot of international students who may not be as affected by this topic. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how the problem of gun violence in the U.S. has changed the world's perspective on the United States, or maybe why international students here should care about the topic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, the concept of like its international impact has been really interesting because I've actually, through my organizing, I've had the privilege of going to a couple of different countries and communicating with students there. And it was very sweet. I remember in Amsterdam, they had actually started a March for Our Lives chapter, even though they didn't have to deal with gun violence. They're like, we support you, which was very sweet. But more important to me is international students organizing for their own issues. I went and I spoke to a group in New Zealand, and they spoke to me specifically about how, in terms of activism, they've had to deal with something called, I want to say poppycock syndrome, but I don't know if that's what it's called, in which you were not it wasn't encouraged to stand up taller than the rest and speak out for fear of getting cut down. And this was something that was, I think, more specific to New Zealand, but may have been an issue in other countries where they didn't necessarily feel a culture of activism in the way America does because our roots are so ingrained in rebellion, realistically. So activism looked a little different for them. And it was kind of encouraging them to speak out on the issues that were important to them. And in New Zealand, it was mental health, and how they could go about organizing for mental health in a way that makes sense for them culturally, because there is a cultural difference. I mean, obviously, Paris and France has a huge history of like rebellion, and I remember keeping up with the protests and the general strikes that were happening in Paris, and seeing that and being like, wow, another country is doing that. Because after being in New Zealand, I kind of was like, oh wow, yeah, international organizing is very different. So I think it is about assessing the needs of your community, but really having that message and that core to lean back on, no matter what your organizing is. If you're passionate about climate justice, then that is the one thing that you need to hold true and remember, because the moment you lose your message is the moment that it all falls apart. So yeah, I think it's about creating this coalition between your peers, and be that a protest or be that simply holding a fundraiser in your school. They're all valid forms of activism. I mean, even art is a form of activism, artivism, as we call it. So it's about being understanding that activism isn't one size fits all. It doesn't look the same for every community and every person, and really working with that.
Hi. So I was just wondering, especially during the
I guess, time period when Parkland was such a prevalent news line, I guess, storyline in the mass media. What was it like to be on the other side of kind of a few fake news narratives that emerged during that period? Like, something I always remember is the videos of your colleague David Hogue in California, and how that kind of transformed into such a big narrative for your organization. So I was always just wondering, like, what it felt like to be on the other side of that, especially as a student and as an individual in such like a stressful period.
Yeah, so we got a lot of hate, a lot of those fake news allegations, a lot of being called crisis actors, and honestly, we kind of had to take it in stride and laugh at it. Because there was so much happening, it was so hard to take some of those accusations seriously. I mean, we were also getting things like death threats, and those were the ones that we were like, okay, maybe we worry about that. But yeah, the crisis actors thing was quite entertaining to me. I remember seeing videos of myself being posted saying a variety of absolutely absurd things about me, pulling up pictures from my mom's Instagram from like 2 years ago, saying that I was pro-violence because I had dressed in a Halloween costume of a character, or calling me a crisis actor and saying that I was the same person as this random blonde girl with glasses, because all blonde girls with glasses are the same person. And it was it was so absurd that we couldn't help but laugh. But then I realized that there was actual like consequences to it, because that video of David in California, David is from California. I've known him since my freshman year of high school, and I remember when that video was released. He's no stranger to controversy, obviously. But that being used against him was something that even my family, one of my grandparents asked me if David was a crisis actor. And I kind of had to, it took me a second to think, oh my God, people actually believe this. Like, not alt-right trolls, but everyday people believe that this is fake. My family questioned if it was fake. So as a journalist, it was a lot to see that like fake news is just like, to see it in real time and in such a personal lens, to experience that accusation was absurd, because I remember seeing it around Newtown when they were saying it was fake, and how damaging that was for the families. And then hearing that Parkland was fake when I had to talk to the families of people who were murdered, and just hearing that that was fake, hearing that everybody's pain and trauma was fake, it was so upsetting that I couldn't let myself get angry, because I don't think I'd ever stop being angry, if that makes sense. So it's a downer, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, I have two quick questions for you. I'm speaking to you from the side here. I'm not sure you can see me there. The first question is, what was the process by which you wrote this paper, this proposal? How did all of you work together? Did you bring in outside experts? Were you dealing with lots of other protest groups that you were in, the activist groups that you were involved with? What was the process of getting that, what I think is a pretty stunning public policy proposal together? And the second question is, since you interviewed all the Democratic candidates at the November forum, maybe you could distill for us what the different candidates said, some of the different Democratic candidates said about gun control particularly, since that's something that is important for a number of us.
So to the first question, it is a great thing to bring up, because we're huge proponents of coalitions across organizations, and we work very consistently with other gun violence prevention organizations. Rather than just try and absorb everyone into our movement, we think it's more important to have different identities and different like core messages that align with each other than to simply be one massive entity. So in writing this, obviously we have a lot of students who do research. They're research interns. They learn about policy. They lobby in Congress, and they have relationships with different legislators, so that they can have a more understanding on that side of it. But we also communicated with organizations like Life Camp and Dream Defenders, who are organizations led out of cities by people of color who are specifically organizing for community-based solutions, who organize for gun violence that isn't mass shooting, that isn't necessarily the same as what we've experienced. So we worked with them to create a more holistic paper. We worked with our student researchers to create a holistic paper, and we took some of the policies that we've known to be effective and that we've pushed for since the very beginning. And with that just came a lot of talks, just communication amongst the organization about things that we thought might be effective and important to include in the paper. And the thing is, the peace plan is a living, breathing document. This is not the final version of the peace plan, because we understand that as communities' needs change and as our political landscape changes, so will the policies in here, and so will the proposals in here. So this is our foundation, but I do believe that there's going to be a lot of growth that comes from it, especially in this very tumultuous year. But yeah, it was definitely a product of a lot of collaboration, and I appreciate you asking me that. Now, on the candidates, which ones are still in the race? See, this was done last November, where almost every Democratic presidential candidate was still running. The only candidate who wasn't able to come was Bernie Sanders because of a medical issue. But their policies are very much aligned with the peace plan. Like, I'm not going to say that there was anybody who was strongly against gun control. That's not a thing really amongst Democratic presidential candidates. Most of them have pretty terrible ratings from the NRA. Most of them supported our policies. I will say that the entire forum was televised, and I believe it was on MSNBC. So you can look it up and see what the candidate said. I didn't get to witness every single one, so I kind of got like a summary of different candidates because I was doing press the whole day. But there was a lot of press output from that specific event that goes over certain policies. And there was variations. I remember Beto O'Rourke was he was running on gun violence prevention at the time because his communities were so impacted by it. So he was definitely more radical in his proposals and what he supported within the peace plan. But like a candidate like Pete Buttigieg wasn't necessarily as revolutionary or radical in their proposals and didn't agree with everything. So it's about prioritizing what specific policies you think are the most important and then seeing what they speak on. Obviously, a lot of them aren't in the race anymore, so I would say maybe only look at the ones that are still in the race. And then like certain people joined the race afterward, like Bloomberg wasn't there because he wasn't in the race yet. The elections, I don't have much to say on the elections besides it's a mess. So I would definitely say research is your biggest tool. And not just research in that like a cursory Google search, but more of like an actual deeper understanding of the way that different policies interact with each other, and really looking at the way that they impact different communities, because oftentimes the people who are commentating on political landscapes don't have to feel the direct impact of policies as much as minority groups do. So I think that's a very important component to it as well. But yeah, I can't necessarily give as accurate of a summary as I would like because that was multiple months ago, but I will say that I wasn't outright upset with anything that was said.
Great.
Thank you. Delaney, first of all, my name's Scott Herr. I'm at the American Church in Paris, and I just want to say thank you so much for your courage and your eloquence and being willing to speak to us tonight. It's really great to hear you. And I just want to say we had a sister march here in Paris on March 24th in 2018. We worked with the American University in Paris, the American School in Paris, Democrats Abroad, and we had a poster-making party over at the church, and then we went up to Trocadero and marched and just wanted to be in solidarity with you. So I want you to know that you've inspired people literally, you already know that, but you've inspired people around the world, and for that we thank you. I also, I'm concerned about gun safety for a lot of reasons, but I'm wondering about the numbers here. I'm so impressed with your boldness. You want to go for it. You want to have courage. You want to speak truth to power. I find these numbers timid in some ways. So I wonder how you came up with these numbers. Like, there are 32,000, let's just say, on average, gun deaths a year in the United States, and you want to half them in 10 years? I think you can do better. And where did you, I hope we can do better, reducing the estimated millions of firearms by at least 30%. I mean, who helped you come up with these numbers? And do you feel like they're bold enough, personally? That's my question.
I I think there was a lot of research that went into it and using the existing data. Data on gun violence prevention and gun safety is historically lacking because there wasn't funding for research into gun violence until very recently. So it's been a major issue of like trying to find information that simply isn't there. And I do think that like I love the passion for wanting it to be more bold. And this definitely, like I said, was a first draft. And I think that all of us have much more much more intense goals. Like obviously I don't want to just half the rate of gun deaths. I want to make it 0. But this is still a work in progress. Sure. I do want to emphasize that. And I do think that personally, a lot of us are much more radical in our beliefs. But that this is something that was like specifically backed up by research into different like polling places and into different houses and things like the gun buyback program, reducing the number of guns in circulation because only so many of the guns in circulation could be removed through the gun buyback program. So it is research based. I was not a research intern. That was kind of left to our our younger members, which I think is wonderful that we're inspiring this younger generation of high school students to really take the mantle from those of us that went away to college. But I personally have probably a much more intense, radical, like let's charge and disrupt the system and go protest and blah blah blah. Like that's a personal belief, but I also know that like we have a lot of really great people who work specifically in the legislative realm, like students who work in the legislative realm, and they created this comprehensive piece. But also we've received like talks about how we can make it better. So it's definitely still going to be made better, if that makes sense.
Go for it.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Sorry. Okay, I'll stand. Yeah. So my question is about how do you talk to someone who believes so differently than you, especially when it comes to gun control and gun violence? I know that I believe so firmly in, what you stand for, but if you're talking to someone else who believes so firmly that they need guns, they need to protect themselves, like what kind of like tools do you use to persuade them? What kind of rhetoric is you think beneficial that you found?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of interesting components to this. Because I definitely am a huge proponent for treating every person like a person, and really just kind of finding that common ground in your humanity and wanting to like save lives and protect people. I had to have a lot of conversations with people that I did not agree with, people who like did not stand for what we stood for. Oftentimes they were counter protesters, and in those conversations we didn't reach a ton of common ground. Sometimes we would, like, I remember one of them was a counter protester who asked me, and this was more a matter of ignorance than anything. He asked me about like why people who are domestic abusers should have guns, and I said no, like we specifically advocate for domestic abusers to not have access to weapons. And that was like this landmark moment for them where they understood what our policies were. So there is that component of misunderstanding, but there's also the fact that like not everybody can have their mind changed by you, no matter how logical your arguments might be. And that's something that I've had to learn because I've been a big proponent of I can talk to everyone and change their mind. Like, I love debating a person. I love getting into a conversation with them and coming out of the other side with us having common ground. But the reality is that isn't always possible. Sometimes they go in there with malicious intent. We've had counter-protesters who have wanted to take advantage of us, who have wanted to damage our organization, and those are not the people that we need to be talking to and that we need to try and reach a consensus with. The truth is we need to focus on mobilizing a disenfranchised community. So while it is powerful to have those conversations and to talk with humanity first and really just find any common ground in a way that isn't partisan, isn't necessarily like the broad policy proposals that we have in here, but something smaller, talking about universal background checks or stuff like that, like loopholes that exist that shouldn't, that is powerful. But also not everybody needs, you don't have to dedicate your time and energy to every single person who disagrees with you. That's an issue that I see a lot with activism, is that we focus so much on those who despise what we stand for that we forget to mobilize those who might agree but might feel left behind by a system. So I do support those conversations, but I think maybe we also should prioritize people who need our attention.
Hi, I don't think I'm in the frame, but I'm gonna wave my hand. Maybe you can see it.
Okay, here you go.
I'm gonna red sweater. So my question is about privilege and intersectionality and inclusivity. So you said that your school is from a more privileged area, and I have two younger sisters who are attending high school right now, who I would also consider attend a quite privileged school. But it sounds like you had to learn a lot about inclusivity and intersectionality on the road of your journey. And my question is just, where do you think that your education system and maybe the education system in less privileged and more privileged communities are failing us as students to become activists and citizens that are actively taking part and changing and including people? Where do you think that your education failed you, and is that part of the change program maybe to target that in the future?
Yeah. I definitely I spent a lot of time on the internet even prior to the shooting. I think being very online, it definitely gave me this informal education on topics like intersectionality and diversity, but it was more in theory. And seeing it, the way that it affects people in every day, and having to come face to face with my privilege definitely required a lot of unlearning. And the truth is, our American education systems do not prioritize teaching activism. It's not a thing that's necessarily encouraged. That's just not the way that the primary school system is built. It's built to encourage cooperation. But I think that there's also this fact of alternate educations being an incredibly valid method, and that your experience is something that you are an expert in, and that is not something to devalue. Something like learning online is a valid avenue. I mean, if your sources are valuable and reliable, these are all different ways that unfortunately we have to access through other means. They're not given to us in the American school system. And there's a lot of issues that I have with education, and I do think increasing access to education is a massively important thing, because I had access to good education. Even then, I wasn't necessarily learning as much as I needed to. I definitely learned about things like interest groups. I learned about that, but I didn't learn about systems of privilege and power. So, I mean, I'm still learning now. I'm a women's studies minor, so a lot of my education is based from the systems of power and class, race, and gender and sexuality. Privileged to have that education, and I've been trying to spread it as much as possible, but I also know that not everyone has access to, first of all, a higher education. Not everyone has access to the internet in the way that I might have. So I think bringing this education in a more understandable way to high schoolers and middle schoolers would be incredible, but I don't necessarily know how that would be done. But yeah, I think access to education is the first most important thing, making sure that everybody gets equity of education, and then growing from there, because America has a lot of growing to do.
Thank you so much again for talking with us.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that you really, as an educator, listening to a young woman like you, so in command of this moment that happened to you and what you've decided to do with your own life, really gives me hope. Gives me hope for your future, but it gives me hope for America's future too. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. I know it's toasty in here. Sorry. Before we close out, I just want to say thank you. I hope you guys all got a lot from that talk, as much as I did. Really quickly, the packets on your chair also have the platforms of all the Democratic presidential candidates right now. And I'd like to invite another one of our board members up, just real quick, to guide you through that. Alessandra Campbell.
Okay. I think it's working. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what you should have been handed is a packet. It should be right behind. I think it should be called the not talking into the mic. It should be called the Democratic Presidential Candidates Gun Control Proposals. And so I'll just simply go over a few of them, some of them that I noticed a lot in media, at least on my feeds. What was coming up a lot. One was Elizabeth Warren She plans on investigating the NRA, lobbying and business practices, and she also wishes to initiate assault weapon bans. Tech exec Andrew Yang, sorry, I always want to say Wang, wishes to invest in technological in innovative technology that would help firearms to be unable to shoot by non-owners of the gun. And those who currently own firearms under Wang, thank you so much, under Wang plan would still have their existing licenses, but would also receive a one-time good gun owner tax credit for adhering to additional requirements. And he also talks about investing in infrastructure to help mental health. And he's one of the few, I think the only other one that talks about mental health in a lot of their policies is Tom Steyer. And also Senator and former Vice President Joe Biden wishes to put a ban on assault rifles. For those who own guns, they will either have to sell their guns back to the government or they will have to register it underneath the National Firearms Act. Mayor Pete Buttigieg wants to help law enforcement combat white nationalism and respond to domestic terrorist attacks as they've occurred. And he plans to have a ban on assault weapons and to also have law enforcement monitor online gun sale sites. So these are just some of the few. If you look in your packets, they'll be more detailed. You can also find this information on each of the individual candidates' campaign sites. I personally did try to look up that of President Trump's site and found absolutely nothing on gun control, to be honest. I did. I really tried. There is one key argument, obviously, that you'll find in all the policies, and that is the problem of assault rifles in the U.S. There are two arguments on both sides. It's whether to ban them altogether or have a buyback ban. But you should definitely read up on the packet, and hopefully this will, hopefully this will influence you and help you in guiding your way for your next 2020 election. Thank you.
Great. Before we invite Scott up to close this out, I just want to remind you that I know in Paris it can feel very disconnected from the United States and may seem like there's not a lot of ways to get involved, but we have Democrats Abroad, which is very active here in Paris. They have debate watch parties, they have debates and forums, and a lot of the presidential candidates have groups on Facebook here that are very easy to find, and they do a lot of activities. And we have a representative from Vote From Abroad here tonight. If you could just wave your hand, that will be here after the event to speak with you and to help you register to vote or answer any questions you have about obtaining an absentee ballot. So please join me in welcoming Scott Hare, the senior pastor at the American Church of Paris.
Thanks, Chloe. Thanks, President Schenck. And I guess Lauren left, but Alessandra, thank you too. I'll be really brief. I just want to say how inspired I am that you're all here, actually, and you care about this. We were humbled to have Delaney speak. That was very inspiring to me as well. And I hope that everyone here is willing to take some time to reflect on just the stakes that are involved here. We have to do something. This is not just an intellectual activity. I was just thinking about a guy named Gary Haugen, who was with the UN. He started the International Justice Mission. He was charged with going to Rwanda and cataloging the numbers of the genocide there. And he was just horrified by what he found. And he realized, wow, we didn't do anything to stop this, and how generations hence will judge us because of our indifference, really. I feel the same way about gun violence, that generations hence will look back if we don't do anything and hold us accountable, hold us responsible. I'm so encouraged because I know you will do so much better than my old generation, than us older people. We don't get it, really. We don't have the passion that you have, and I want to encourage you. Now, I'm independent politically, in theory. I don't think you can be indifferent politically today. Just today, it's 30 349 days since the U.S. House of Representatives passed a law to do background checks on all gun sales in the United States, and they sent it to the Senate. That's 349 days since Mitch McConnell has refused to give this bill the light of day. No discussion, no activity. That's 349 days in which over 32,000 Americans will have been killed by guns. That's 340 days, as of today, of justice deferred for those who have lost loved ones to gun violence in my country. Now, we come from different countries. How many of we Americans here? Most, all of us, not all of us, but most of us here. So it's our responsibility, see, to do something. And ever since December 14th, 2012, we talked about this, the Newtown Sandy Hook massacre. I mean, we just thought something has to happen now. Well, it didn't. But since then, there have been 2,360 mass shootings in the United States of America, and thousands, tens of thousands of people have been killed due to gun violence, old and young alike. And so along with other leaders, I'm just convinced, I'm passionate, like the rest of my life, however long or short it is, I want to do something, and I want to encourage other people to do something. That's why every year since then, we've tried to do a memorial, tried to do some kind of forum. And I'm leaving Paris now this year, and I am absolutely delighted that the baton has been passed to you students, to the history, law, and society. I hope you continue to hold the torch high here. Every year, have some kind of educational opportunities to encourage people to actually do something. Because it's not about taking away everybody's guns. It's not about ignoring the Second Amendment. It's not about, creating some kind of a utopia that everybody's going to dismiss. It's about doing what all of the other developed nations in the world have already done. It's not impossible. There's something very dark about our culture of violence, a culture that's been traumatized by all kinds of violence from its inception. I'm particularly in Black History Month trying to educate myself. Go to 1619, the New York Times series, that get educated, and you realize, there are some really, really unhealthy roots that we need to pull out, and fix. But it's not a partisan issue. There are tens of thousands of people that are being killed. They're Democrats, they're Republicans, they're socialists, they're independents, it's all the rest. This affects everybody. And so I encourage you to do something, right? I think she's had some brilliant ideas. Get on board with something, pray for our parents, our families, those people who are affected. I mean, the first responders, you have no idea. I have colleagues who were there at Newtown to care for the first responders. Their lives will never be the same, right? To see the trauma of little children that you wouldn't recognize them by what happened to them. You also need to be more informed about gun violence and the scope and why it's so strangely, out of proportion in our country, compared to the rest of the developed world. Write your Congress people, write your senators, donate money, if you have that capacity. Get involved. Gabby Giffords is a PAC that I really want to support. She's been on the screen here at one of these forums before, and her organization is actually impacting other municipal governments to enact sane, gun laws and stuff. I surely want to support the Parkland Students' Peace Plan for a Safer America. It's a real crisis, see. And if you're human, if you want to grow into the fullness of your humanity, I'm just here to encourage you to uphold the values of our Declaration of Independence, that all people are endowed with the right to life. That's just so basic. Right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we say, So do something. And I just, again, want to thank you for being here. And you cannot remain passive. Commit to do something now. You're going to vote, right? But not just you. You got to encourage all your colleagues. Get involved in canvassing. Come on over to the church. Help register people to vote, or do it. I think you did a bunch of voter registration last time, so we're going to do that again this year. But just get involved. So thank you very much.